With how important training is to driving the stimulus of hypertrophy, one of the big aspects of being able to deliver a stimulus is our ability to have skill within the patterns that we're doing. So obviously training is going to be a skill that's developed over time. Performing these different movements is going to be a skill that's developed over time as well. And we can have different levels of skill for different body parts. And today we're going to talk about skill adaptation and training and how it could potentially lead to you having some weak body parts and one way we can start to address them. So when we think about hypertrophy, it's an adaptation that occurs from a stimulus. So if that ability of you to provide that stimulus to the muscle group is poor, then it is unlikely that that body part will adapt. And this is often where we see weak body parts, especially with people that have trained for a long period of time and they get to the upper levels of their bodybuilding career. They still have weak body parts. Most of the time, these advanced trainees that have this have bad habits in regards to how they've trained that body part for a long time. And those habits have just stuck and they haven't gone through the process of fixing those habits in order to change how well they provide that stimulus so that their stimulus per set is more efficient and they can actually provide a stimulus that's going to make that muscle group adapt. Now, in order to fix this with advanced trainees or even intermediate trainees, no matter the level, there is a high level of buy-in that has to happen because most of the times, especially when you're working with those people that are intermediate to advanced, there's some level of ego that's attached to their ability to train. And so stripping them back to ground zero and then building them back up from that ground zero, a lot of times can see large reductions in load and not being able to perform from a performance standpoint that they might have been capable of in the past, even though those performance metrics were based off of patterns that were inefficiently providing stimulus to the target tissues. So with that, this is where we really need to point out what is the problem? Why is this a problem for them fixing that weak body part? And then start to kind of build out what that solution is going to be on paper. Now, something I think that is important to learn when you're doing this with athletes is that there's stages of learning that occur when you start to strip back movement patterns for a body part. And so in order for someone to relearn a pattern, they're going to go through different variations of these levels of learning in order to be able to gain and understand the new skill, develop it, and utilize it as like a second habit or a second nature without having to really fully think about it. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something to understand that this is why it takes time. And then we can start to talk about ways that we expedite this process with people as we kind of build out this presentation a little bit further. So basic stages of learning, just as like a surface level. We're not going to get into the depths of like the different ways that we can go about teaching people throughout these different levels or anything along those lines, how long these could be for various different athletes, just some general concepts so that you understand it. The cognitive phase is just the early stages of motor learning. So this is the introduction of the new skill. So this would be like if there's a problem pattern or a problem with the way that someone's moving, introducing that new skill of moving in the correct way for that pattern or the global array of patterns that fit that kind of dynamic of movement. Secondarily would be the associative phase. Now, this associative phase is that development stage, and this is probably the broadest category in all the different ways that we can drive the development phase. This is where people begin to connect the dots of the how-to or the introduction of the new skill into the real life doing of it. So they're starting to create those mental bridges that are going to allow them to develop that ability to execute the pattern and slowly start to strip away how much they have to think about the new skill while they're kind of learning that. So this would be multiple different ways that you can do this. We're going to talk about one in the back end today that's a very easy to use, low barrier to entry, common thing in order to address this with athletes. And then finally would be the autonomous stage where this person can perform the task with little conscious effort. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. This takes time. You might have to reset ground rules within the associative phase in order to be able to get this person to develop it to the autonomous phase. And so really one of the biggest things when it comes to developing this with an athlete is that there's some prerequisites that come with fast tracking their ability to pick up the skill and then translate it into actual training, providing the stimulus, and then finally creating a result that's better than what they've previously done. So this is where a lot of times I really like doing this work in a health phase or in a post-show phase where we're really kind of starting from ground zero. If it's a post-show phase or during a health phase, we can start to kind of tinker with movement patterns and how we're going to fix it. But the end all be all of all of this is that movement quality must be high from the introduction. It must be high from the very beginning. Everything that you do to develop someone's skill hinges upon the quality at which that skill is performed and the quality at which that skill is introduced. And this is where we'd want to build cues, not only for the athlete to understand what are we trying to do, but also building cues for them to understand what does it feel like or what tends to push them into swaying away from the ideal. This is where training footage as a coach is huge, because you can just be that constant reminder of, hey, you're not executing this the way you need to execute it. And you need to understand that this is not going to get us from point A to point B. So the first point to make is the quality of the movement upon introduction has to be very high quality. This is where you're going to spend the most time ensuring that it's right and making sure that it's something that person understands, so that when we go into step 2, we can often use repetition and frequency as your friend. So the more times they can visit that movement pattern or that just global ability to move, the more often we're going to start to kind of build those connections, build those bridges that create that transition from the understanding of the new skill and how to into the actual real life doing it. Now, to reference number 1, a lot of practice that's poor quality is not going to matter, because what underpins step 2 is the quality of the movement. So if we don't introduce it at a high level, and we don't build in systems that keep that person at a high level of execution with that skill, then this repeated execution is not going to stick, and it's not going to be something that progresses over time, which is where, as a coach, what you're going to do is you're going to ask them to send you training footage of that skill over and over and over and over again. Week after week, they're going to send it every week just to make sure that they stay on top of it as they're learning it. We're going to have an example of this in a second. And then finally, we're going to use regression patterns where necessary. You see this a lot when you're rebuilding a squat for someone, because someone needs to learn, let's say, foot pressure and maintaining pelvic stability in the bottom of a squat. Well, we want to put them in positions that make that really easy to do, so they can understand what that feels like, they can get productive quick, and they can have a productive training block. And then when they're at a place where they can start to kind of upscale that ability to execute whatever it is they're fixing, so like a transition phase or a post-show phase, we can escalate up the regression, challenge that skill in a different way. So whether that would be moving into something that loads length and in-range more, or creating more internal stability versus external stability, something that challenges that a bit more, where they start to move up that progression and more challenging that skill and make it a little bit more second nature, and even further take it from being something that they're developing into something that just happens as a second nature. And so this is kind of where using that regression and finding where it's easiest to implement can really help that person learn the skill, because the easier it is to learn, the quicker they'll learn it, and then you'll be able to escalate the challenge as they go throughout. So this was quite a bit of theoretical. So like the whole concept of this is, most people have weak body parts because of an inability to provide a stimulus well. These problems oftentimes come from needing to learn the skill of how to provide that tension stimulus. And so we need to understand that this is kind of what this process looks like. And what this could look like is how to teach an RDL. So this is just an example that I pulled so that you can kind of understand where this could potentially start to transition into someone actually learning this, of learning how to do an RDL better than what they previously had done in order to create a better, more robust hypertrophy stimulus within the hinge. So this is just a classic 2-on, 1-off split setup. This split setup has 3 lower days within it. And so what you could do is you're going to have one primary RDL output day. This is where you're challenging under a load. So this is where you're trying to make progressions. You're doing maximal load for the RDL pattern. And so your challenge here within that RDL is going to be the ability to maintain execution and the skill of the pattern within the highest loads that you can handle within that pattern. The second lower day would be movements that could aid in that ability to drive tension to the RDL. So this could be inverse leg curls. This could be single-legged RDLs. This could be hip airplanes. It would largely depend on kind of what the issue with hinging is for that individual. But this is something that's going to develop that capacity to drive hamstring tension in an RDL in a way that is loading it into an eccentric, forcing them to put hips in a position that loaded into the eccentric, or maintain positions in order to load the hamstring appropriately. And this could be a stability problem. This could be a variety of different things, but this is going to be like secondary patterns that help them develop this. And then when we go into the last lower body day, they're going to have what's called RDL learning sets. So these would be something that could be later in the session. They're just building that frequency of doing more of the RDL pattern. They're not going to be doing this at maximal loads that you would see in that primary RDL output day, because it is going to be later in the session. They'll probably keep this at 1 rep in reserve, but this is more just practicing the skill of driving a lot of tension to the target tissues through the RDL. And this could last for a pretty long period of time. More advanced athletes, a lot of time will pick this up a bit quicker, where you can get in and out of it a bit faster. And then the less experience an athlete has, typically the longer this learning period can be. Now, where this really works, and as you can see here with this, is people who need to specialize body parts with their training split. So this is kind of where it really fits the mold of high volume landmarks, probably having to have high volume landmarks because they have a weak body part, and then having a weak body part because they don't know the skill of executing a pattern. So like this is step 1 in that process, is fixing the skill of executing the movement with the split design and how frequent they visit that. Remember, the quality of the stimulus and how that's delivered from the very get-go and how they understand it is extremely important, because high frequency in revisiting those patterns is not going to matter if the skill is not executed at a high clip.